Hello everyone, this recording is in request from a couple of you around how to use sort of the tools like IDA and Ghidra and then combining that with a debugger. Unfortunately, during the lecture the camera wasn't working and I wasn't too sure about the microphone, so I decided to record this separately after the lecture so everyone still benefits from what happened in the lecture. Now, speaking of mics, you're probably hearing me now. It sounds like a bloody Coke can. I'm not an audio guy, and you can clearly tell YouTube was never ever for me. But today what I'm going to be speaking about is the Hermetic Viper sample that I talked about in the lecture on Tuesday. Okay? So what we'll need for this is you'll need to have the sample itself if you want to have a go. If not, that is absolutely fine. You can take some of the bits from this and use it on your own one for your own assignment. Okay? So, I'm going to firstly start in IDA like I did on the lecture, and then I will move towards Ghidra, and I'll explain how you can work back and forth, or if you want to work in one, how you can find all stuff in one, so on and so forth. Okay? But when you first move into IDA, you'll see a few blocks like this of the graph, which is your main function, okay, or your start address. This is also the same if you have a DLL, but it'll just be referred to as the DLL entry point, okay? Depends on what you have. So, starting point, the first thing we can do is we could look through the main function. For some malware, it's fantastic. For some malware, it's not very useful whatsoever. If any of you have a DLL sample, DLLs aren't amazing at entry point, okay? So a bit of digging is required. However, first things, as I keep reiterating to all of you, is yes, this is daunting. Yes, the assembly can be a little bit overwhelming to start with. What you need to focus on, as I said, if you're in IDA, I want you all to focus on these actual little libraries down here, or APIs, all in pink, okay? Not all of them will be useful. Some of them will tell you absolutely nothing, and some of them will simply just be because software needs it to run. Alright? Now, if we're starting in main, and we want to actually have a look at it, I'm just going to come out a bit here. If we scroll down, we can see some bits around string to integer write, get the process heap, heap allocation for memory, get the current process, and then open process token, okay? Starting from here, what does this actually tell us? Well, if you read it, it may tell you some stuff, it may tell you nothing at all. But you can see that a process is being created, and then we open the process token for it, okay? If you guys want to see actual processes be running, I highly recommend going back a step and looking at your dynamic analysis using Procmon, Process Explorer, those dynamic analysis tools we talked about in week 4 and you guys practiced with in week 5, okay? Some of the stuff is very much, it's there and we may not need to have a look at it, but first things, if you ever open up your malware, for most of you, you'll have a lot of literature to help you. How did they do the analysis? Let me go find it myself. That is absolutely fine. But think about from the perspective of if you ever go into industry and you ever analyze malware further on from this, you get a sample, you don't know what that is. It's a brand new bit of malware. What do we actually do? Okay. If we're starting main function, we want to pick up on the sort of API calls where we know malware is very, very used to using them. Okay. Like so in this block here, we have lookup privilege value W, call down here as well, and then adjust token privileges. As you guys can see here on the SC backup privilege, all right, this block is essentially something to do with privileges, okay? A lot of malware out there will need to run in admin mode if it's on Windows, or even go further and run a system, okay? That way it has full control over your operating system to do as it well pleases, okay? So if you're looking to screenshot something and you know for certain that there's privilege escalation, I would expect something along the lines of seeing these API calls, and then you can explain some of the assembly inline a little bit more yourself in your assignment, okay? But let's say we have a few more we wanted to look at. I'll come back to this service stuff here, guys, because it's important later on, okay? Firstly, what we may want to look at is keep looking at those APIs. To do so, go to imports in the tab up here. you'll be listed all the DLLs that your malware will import from the very start without running it, okay? Kernel 32, user 32, ADV API 32 are used a lot by pretty much most software, okay? There's nothing inherently wrong or bad with not just even these ones, but all the ones being used in this example, okay? However, the first point you may want to look at is, look at DLLs that you don't typically recognize, okay? The first one that we talked about and we popped up with is this lz32.dll, okay? It's only using free API calls. However, LZ is all to do with compression on an operating system, okay? So if we know this is malware, we can see it going on here. Okay, we have some compression going on. So what you want to do is, probably any one of these is okay, double click it and you've got your entire block here of what this does. Now, if you scroll up or down, you'll start to see the entire sort of sequential process your malware takes. Can be very, very useful. Do I expect some of you will screenshot this to show some processes being made and what control flows go with what? Absolutely. However, if you want to explore this on a easier level, we can see LZ close, copy, and open file W are all together. So what we're going to do is, if you see sub and then the number, that's the subroutine that this is all part of, and it will take you to the graph view here, okay? Now, as you can see in probably the graph at the bottom down here, it's quite a heavy and long process if we go all the way to the top. There is a possibility, guys, that not all of this subroutine is going to be of value to you, okay? Now, depending on your malware as well, some of this stuff may be completely separate and completely obfuscated, okay? However, in the case of Hermetic Viper, it was quite obvious about what it was trying to do, and in many ways, you couldn't stop it, okay? Now, what I want to focus on is this stuff here. I want to focus on the strings at this point here. The DLV XP x64, x86, x64, and then x86 here. We spoke about this now. If you ever see DRV in a string format like this, it's referring to your drivers, okay? The big point is, guys, of driver usage, of course, if you didn't know what this sample was and it wasn't Hermetic Viper, you may be thinking, okay, could be a rootkit. Remember, not rootkits sometimes don't operate with drivers because they may be user mode. A lot of stuff may not operate with drivers, so you may go, okay, it's not a rootkit. But some malware does, guys, okay? Now, what it will look for here is the type of driver, and then it will look for a very specific operating system, okay? So if you can see, you've got XP here, it's referring to Windows XP, okay? You've also got then the standard x64 and x86 architecture, okay? This is around using the drivers and checking compatibility, okay? So it's ensuring that if you have a very older version of Windows, that the malware can still run on it from getting the drivers from the RC data. And you can see this stuff, RC data, guys, will typically be found in resources, which we'll look at a bit later when we look into Ghidra, okay? What's really important is the drivers are being used and the check is being performed here to see, can I run and can I run on multiple systems, okay? Essentially, this is trying to see and assess how effective can malware be. In this case, quite a lot. So it will find the resources and double check which and call to see which operating system are you a part of, okay? Load the resource if you are a part of it. In most cases, it will work. And then moving on, you'll see current controller, and this launch sim with system down here, guys, okay? And crash control. We'll talk about this when we come to privilege escalation properly, okay? But this is what you may want to see, guys. If you guys ever see reg set value or reg whatever, this is around registry keys being created, made, deleted, updated, whatever. Again, I highly recommend RegShot is the most valuable tool to truly see the takeover and what registries are done, okay? But if you see, we are setting the registry value and then closing that registry key, and it's to do with this EPM TDRV down here, okay? Which stands for essentially empty drive, okay? And then print that out and then to a specific destination, as you can see here, okay? What we are doing at this point, guys, is we are essentially looking to use the drivers, and we're using legitimate drivers. If you look at these drivers more specifically in resources, even on basic static analysis, you guys will see that these are legitimate signed drivers that essentially the malware is hijacking to perform some operation that seems legitimate to Windows systems. Okay? If you don't see this, you may typically see drivers being created by malware, and it's what we call a bring your own vulnerable driver, or bring your own driver used by malware, and sometimes the OS can pick up that it's just another driver, but in this case it's using signed drivers, so legitimate drivers already being used. Okay? So, if we want to go further with this, we can actually scroll a bit further. So we load the resource, and then it checks the size of resource, and we saw it goes into system, an empty drive down here, and then get the system directory once that form's completed. And some of the stuff I'm going through, guys, just sort of to make, because it's not as important compared to the grand scheme of things, okay? So, as well, guys, if you see LZ open file alongside something like write file or create file, that does not necessarily mean it's specifically just for files. Create file W and delete file W can also be creating driver files, okay? And maybe any other files that are required. If you've got looking at .pem files for storing keys, if your malware does store keys on an OS, on the victim's OS, this will also be used, okay? So bear that in mind, that it's not just standard files, it can be any type of file, like driver files, PM files, and various others on an operating system, okay? Checks the number of bytes to write, open the file and write to it, and then close the file and save it, okay? Big point here is, guys, after that close is done, it looks at system32, okay? You may typically see this depending on your operating system, okay? What you need to be aware of, guys, is some of your malware may be 32-bit or 64-bit, okay? And it either needs to double check, can I run because I'm a 32-bit based malware, or my 64-based bit? Not really in the grand scheme of things as important for your assignment, but it's something to be aware of, okay? Now, we've got another long string, a long one here, okay? System, current control set, and services, okay? We'll come back to services here because you'll see that a lot of malware either becomes its own service or will take on a service being created, latch onto it, i.e. living off the land, to perform some form of operation, okay? And that's kind of the end of that here. So quite an important one here, all right? Now, if we look back at imports where we had it and we go back a sec, you can see that it was at subroutine 4029DO, okay? What you can do is you can search up here, you got 402.90, and then you can go through all of them here. So 402.920, 402.90, which is what we were just in. If you've explored this to your depth, what I recommend is right-clicking it, rename, and this is one of the beauties of IDA, rename this function to anything you seem fit. So in case you have to come back and forth on your malware, you know where you've left off. Okay? It's entirely up to you. Do I expect you to rename functions and rename entire subroutines to show me what? I don't. It's just for your benefit to see how the malware may work later on if you're coming back to it. And especially if your malware is more complex, like if any of you have done pure worms, or if any of you were doing rootkits, or wipers can be a bit more deceptive based on the fact that once they wipe everything, that's it. So it may be worthwhile. Okay? Now, I talked about previous escalation a bit earlier. What we're going to do is we're going to follow the same sort of process that I just went through there, okay? What we want to look for is, if I just do a simple Control F on this screen here in the import, I'm going to look for anything with priv, or privileges, okay? And we saw some, and we can see some here. Again, ADV API 32, not a malicious DLL whatsoever, but adjust token privileges is something we want to have a look at. Same process. We find the control flow, as you can see on the tab here, ever so maybe slightly after what we just looked at, okay? So we double click here and have a look, all right? So we've got some stuff already on, we talked about drivers, we can already see low driver privilege, okay? So after the drivers are being signed and checked and actually used by malware, we can already infer that it's look up the privilege value of those drivers and then adjust the token privileges. If you guys ever see SC load something privilege, followed by lookup privilege, and then adjust. That is probably some form of privilege escalation going on, and something you should really take a look at, and something in your assignment I really want to know about. It's so important to see how malware will adjust its privileges based through, does the file get privileges? Does, in this case, drivers get privileges? Okay. For context, guys, the reason why Hermetic Viper uses drivers and makes the drivers have higher privileges is because the higher privileges, it can go straight to kernel and any other low-level calls without anyone at the system actually checking for a user, are you sure you want to do this, or you must be an admin to do so. It's already in the higher up privileges, it can do so automatically. Okay, this is, if any of you see wiper properties in your malware, and you may do for some of you, I would suggest looking at this, because if a wiper will typically, once it wipes the MBR or the MTR or any other part of your OS, what it will do is it will try and do it from a low level point so it can attack it straight on the physical drive. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Okay, so we load the driver privileges, and then even if we're running as admin or system, privileges may not be enabled by default, so just be aware that malware will still always try this just to ensure that it is going to be in the correct privilege mode it needs to be in. Okay, it could just be a simple check of lookup privilege value, so if it looks it up and realizes we're already an admin, okay, we don't need to adjust it, we can move straight on. Okay, that can happen as well. Okay, immediately after, and admittedly the beauty of Hermetic Viper is it's very open about what it does, so for some of you, you may experience that. For some other malwares, it's not as open. Service is active, okay? This is very, very important, guys, to see that once it's being created, a service is being created, okay? That service is then run on your machine to then essentially become, the malware becomes a service, and it can run pretty much freely without you ever realizing it, okay? So again, we're going to query service status, create service, and what will typically happen, guys, is it's not as obvious in IDA, but what you may see in Gidra is a loop occurring, so it's constantly checking, can that service be running? Okay, not all the time, but can be a possibility. So, if we move further down and see if we can get anything, okay? Concurrently, service handles are getting closed left, right, and center, okay? And then set the last error is being performed, okay? So we've already had a look through this and how it uses the drivers and then it performs a privilege escalation to run as a service to perform the wiper properties. Okay, so really, really important. All right. Now, if we want to actually register the drivers, possibly, we may want to look at something about creating itself as a service. We slightly saw that, but let's look at it properly in detail. Okay. So we've got create file, create thread, create event. We've also got create service W. So we're going to do that there. And then we go to 403.930, okay? So, we see that form there, start service, and then kind of what we just saw here, okay? If you already see it and you guys sort of follow it in like we just did, you don't need to just do the step of going back, but it may just be worthwhile in case any other services are being created outside of other subroutines, okay? Just worth a check. So, create service W and then change service config W, you may see as well, is to install and modify services representing the malicious driver. It will write the driver binary to the disk and registers as a legitimate Windows service, so it's some form of covert operations, i.e. you see the service, it's malware, but to Windows, it's going to treat it as any other service on the operating system. It's a simple covert mechanism, but it is a covert mechanism nonetheless. I do not care how simple the process can be to create covert mechanisms or persistent mechanisms or any other propagation, infection, whatever, guys. If it's vital to how the malware is going to run more complex later on, I need to know about it and you need to know about it as well. Okay, so bear that in mind. If the service exists, it will reconfigure itself, okay? It's to make sure that if it's already done, it doesn't need to redo the whole process again. I'm running already. It's all good to go, okay? Especially if you see anything kernel-based, it will be typically this process will be involved, okay? Now then, for a lot of you, you are all looking at ransomware. No surprise there, ransomware is probably the most common type of malware besides ransomware as a service, a subset of ransomware, out in the wild right now because there's financial gain. You don't always have to see a ransomware purely on its own. You could have a wiper with ransomware properties as well. It may not make sense, but I'm going to show you why it can make sense. First thing you want to do, go back to your imports, look for anything crypt based. This will refer to anything around cryptography, encryption, decryption, creation of keys, destruction of keys, so on and so forth, okay? Here's another point, guys. CryptGen Random is sort of your de facto go-to, I would say, to always have a look at, all right? And we will do so now. So you can see it down here in this subroutine here. You can also see just above it, you can see get system time as file name and some other stuff as well. Create the process heap so it can all move around freely, okay? Now, what we're doing here is the CryptGen Random, it doesn't always have to be for keys, guys. CryptGen Random will use the randomness library within Windows to actually create random bits of data. That could be a key, so you can randomly generate them so you're not reusing the same key. It could also just be any bit of data you well please, okay? It will generate essentially a buffer for it as well, which you can kind of see beforehand in the EBP plus phprov up here, okay? These bytes will actually be later written to the disk sectors, okay? Because it's a wiper, I can just say that to you right now. We'll see that when we move to Ghidra, but what you'll typically see for utter destruction, guys, is to destroy the MBR or any other part of your disk on your OS, what it will do is it will create random bytes of data that overrides a part of the MBR. So your OS tries to read the MBR, and because it's all now just random bytes from the buffer, it goes, okay, I don't know what to do with that, just everything gets wiped on it because I can't read it anymore. Okay, it's a very common trope that a lot of wipers do use, even if your malware is not directly a wiper. Okay, so it's one of the key behavioral bits to know about for actually wipers themselves. Okay, create the process heap, crypt release context, and we actually perform and actually get the bytes to be used later on. Okay, where those bytes go, you may not see that from this process here, and as you can see, it's just there's comparisons and there's a lot of small little jumps in between. Okay, so some bits it may not be as useful. All right, that's something to be aware of as we move forward now. Okay, so another point to have a look at before we move into it, and as you guys probably can see through this, I'm sort of jumping here, there, and everywhere. That's kind of because you can, but it's harder to follow malware intuitively. Meaning, if you are going into the mindset of your assignment and going, I'm going to analyze all the infection stuff first, then all the propagation, then all the covert. I can promise you now, malware doesn't work like that. It will try pretty much it may depend on the malware, but it may try some propagation first, then do the infection. It may do propagation, then covert, and then after the covert's performed, then do the infection, or it can be mixture here, there, and everywhere. And I'm sure some of you have actually seen that, okay? Don't worry if you find stuff out of order, that's okay. If you can piece it together afterwards, for your own sake to understand the true behavior and the timeline, great. If you can't, it's not the end of the world, but it may be of use if you can try it, okay? Now, for most of you, you have actual malware that already exists. I know a lot of you doing WannaCry and part of the Petya family. There is plenty and plenty of documentation on it. Even if you're not doing it, okay? Please bear in mind, guys, that, as I said there, CryptGen Random's applied to both. It can be for ransomware, it can be for wiper, it could be for some other malware, okay? You could find a paper that explores different API calls that are used in multiple malware. So it's a more generic paper, but the same process has been applied here. I can match it up with that paper. Boom, reference done. Please remember that, because I'm not expecting you to always just have, I'm going to use pure WannaCry papers. No, I expect a mixture of stuff. I expect you guys to use maybe like certain approaches from the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You may have used a certain process or categorization to actually help you get with your end result. I don't need to know the process behind it, but you know about it, and you can say, end result, here it is, discussion in the assignment. Okay? Just so you're aware. Another one you want to look at, guys, anything to do with input and output control, which is usually defined as device stuff, which we have here. Okay? Device input output control, and then we have this subroutine here. Okay? Now, as you can see, it's a fairly decent, it's not as decently sized as the other ones, but still decently sized. So we have IO control, create process heap, and then call it back again as well. Okay, what is this actually doing? Okay, what we're looking at is essentially looking again at the drivers. Okay, the malware communicates using the Windows API device IO control. Okay, it's to allow for the drivers to actually be controlled, used on the operating system. Okay, it will unlock for disk access, and because the drivers already go to low level, IO control then controls them to go to low level. You now have access to the disk. The malware can start doing what it wants to with it. Okay. User mode and kernel mode execution, it depends, but overall you may commonly see this in both. Okay. So we use device IO control, get last error, and essentially all this process here down here is moving the drivers to the physical drive at locals, and then control them once again to make sure that they can be executed to perform the wiper operations. Okay, so that's kind of overview in IDA. You can go all out in just IDA if you want to. Okay, however, certain bits in IDA may not be as useful to find as the likes of Ghidra. So from now, I'm going to be working in Ghidra for the most part. Okay, so if you want to use IDA still, please use IDA. It's a very useful tool. For any of you who are really struggling with understanding C, IDA may be a bit better because its decompiler isn't great and it isn't in your face like a Ghidra. Okay, but if we actually move to Ghidra and let's run this thing. Okay, I'm going to talk about as well in this briefly the loader, i.e. the worm component of Hermetic Viper, but you'll clearly see why Ghidra is also very good at identifying when we can't go further with an analysis from a static level. Okay, and I'll explain it in a bit. So if we load up the sample again, but in this time we'll load up in Ghidra. Okay, so once it's loaded, we need to actually be able to analyze it, and we could go further if we wanted to and actually look at the same stuff to doubly confirm. I'm not expecting you guys to doubly confirm stuff because you found it once, you know what it does. If it's clearly shown it's doing exactly that, that's enough for me. Okay, if you want to find further stuff, it may be worthwhile. If you're going to find everything within IDA or a Ghidra, also absolutely fine. Okay, but you'll see clearly in here that certain bits may not be as useful. Okay, so we have the main function actually here. Okay, and it has a bunch of stuff in the actual decompiler, and what you may guys want to focus on is, I recommend don't always rely purely on this decompiler. It is very nice. Compared to most decompilers out there, Ghidra is probably, in my opinion, the best by quite a long shot. Okay, however, decompilers are trying to take previous source code that's been converted to an exe, takes the assembly of said exe, and then tries to reconvert it back to a C-like format from the exe. So it's not perfect. It does a very good job, don't get me wrong, but for some bits, it may not be as potent what it's actually doing. Okay, but again, where do you start from here? What we did, and we spoke about drivers. Okay, if you see at the top here, guys, what Ghidra does nicely is break everything down into a tree-like format with all your different sections of your section table from your executables structure. Okay, let's say we want to look at resource section. Okay, and I'm going to just move this along slightly so we can see it. Okay, we can see a bunch of stuff down here around image being used, and if any of you have used or looked at Hermetic Viper, there's like this weird present thing that's used as instead as the icon. Do I have any like real major reasons why it's there? No. Is it there just for some more messing around? Most likely. Okay, little subsets of that, but what I want to focus on is stuff down here. Okay, you have in here RC data drive x64, so all the stuff we looked at previously in IDA. Okay, it's actually coming from the resource section. So what you could do, let's say it's your assignment, is you talk about it through your IDA stuff, but your secondary screenshot in the same figure shows it's coming from the resource section, which you found through Ghidra. Okay, you can explain, guys, and maybe you want to think, if I've got stuff flowing from the resources, should it be doing that? If it's not, why is malware using the resource section of PE to load stuff like drivers or check for driver compatibility? Or if it's any other files for that matter, not just driver files, okay? So do bear that in mind, okay? But the common place I think a lot of you will need to start is if you go to window here, you then go down to define data and define strings, or do define strings. You'll get every string from this sample, okay? Now, some of them, as you can see, are just the APIs we had originally that we've already seen, okay? You can also see them down in this symbol tree down here, okay? Now, where this is going to shine is we want to look for, and this is where some research can come into play, common strings used inside, let's say, a wiper or wherever your malware is, okay? We've already seen the empty driver one down here, but this one here, guys, this is a really, really important one. The physical drive here. So if I double click it, what it will do is if I go into here, is it will show me where it's at in the actual assembly code. If you see this xref, it just means cross-reference, okay? And if I click this function and I go into decompiler, it will show me the actual function that's used and actually tries to recode it or say decompile it back to a C-like format for you to actually have a look at, okay? So if we see at the top here, the physical driver we've found, okay? This is used commonly, so most wipers will actually look for this directory in the physical drive so it can actually perform the process of adding the random bytes to the MBR, specifically it adds 512 in this case, and then overwrite it so it can be corrupted, okay? What you can see here is though, so it's essentially a buffer allocation and then preparation loop. So all this, the while loops down here, okay? Often this essentially is like enumerating over the physical drive up here. This is from the heap, it's adding that random bytes we saw with cryptgem random. And as we can see, after it's done that, controls the drivers to do so, okay? This is to ensure that all parts of the MBR that's required is overwritten in this while loop here. Okay, so just bear that in mind. This is where Ghidra shine, guys, as well, just as a little sidetrack. We saw that the device control was called twice, okay? You can see it actually being called up here, and then you can see it also being done down here, okay? What this will do is actually show you that loop in between that I've just spoke about, that may be a point to go, okay, that more technical side of it and that more sort of detailed understanding may be worthwhile, which is where Ghidra, I think, shines the brightest compared to IDA, okay? So, we can see there, and then it's going to essentially destroy the disk content and then bypass all file system protections, okay? This is also to ensure that it contains full control, and then there's going to be no sort of security that prevents us from doing this process, okay? So, if we actually want to go further as well, we can look at the registry options, which will use the same process again. Windows, and then we want to go down to define strings, or we can go down into our actual functions down here. But define strings, just to quickly show it off, okay? Filter by, let's look at some registry stuff, so reg, okay? We want to look at, let's start with open key here, okay? Again, be processed down here, and you can see it here quite clearly. Now, what you may have a case is, guys, registry open key W, and there's no way to point it to either, okay? That is a big possibility in a lot of this, and I'll explain it a bit later, okay? However, for the sake of just showing off this as well, I'm actually going to go to, looking back up, all the way back up to that empty driver point here and explain that a bit further, okay? Which is in here, and is at this function point here, and then we go to this point here where we can see get last error and flush file buffers, okay? We can also see wprint file, or you can sometimes see, if we go back a sec, if we double click that again, it actually is cross-referenced in two separate functions. So you may want to explore both, and I highly recommend it. Explore that other one, sec. Let's do that there, go to here as well, see what we get, okay? So, what we see here is about resources, and then we've actually got the registry key stuff down here, okay? Here's why I want to explain it. Because malware essentially edits the registry key, as those under what's called the crash control. So any forensic capabilities that may try and stop this process or analyze it, it's much harder to do, and essentially it's a lot more difficult to see that malware once it starts to run, how it's actually starting to prepare itself for the wiper mode as well. Okay, so allows to adapt to different installations, and then ensures the drive is stored where Windows expects kernel modules. Okay, so kind of what we spoke about, but shows you a more clear-cut process, very complex process at that, about how this can all work. And if you highlight it, it will show you the exact point in the assembly for you to see it as well. Okay, so that's another big part as well. We saw the embedded driver stuff, which is really which was part of that as well. So see the driver stuff. Okay, now we can see maybe an exit path as well, and what you guys may see is some malware needs a system to restart in order to take hold. Okay, to do so, what you probably want to do is to start with, so you're not completely lost, is look for the Sleep API, okay, which is in here. All right, so we've got Sleep at this point here, or if we actually look into it from this perspective, we can look for Sleep directly, which is in kernel32.dll. Okay, we see Sleep here, and it's called in multiple functions and even at our entry point. Okay, so we compile entry and we see Sleep here. Okay, and then a bunch of function calls afterwards. Okay, essentially this is our cleanup process. Okay, and what you guys will see as well just above is this Windows System 32 Win MVT logs. Okay, what you guys need to be aware of is if you see anything like this, this is a covert method that I want to know about. What malware will do is sometimes it will clear its logs in order to, if the system comes back up, it can't be traced exactly what steps it made, what API calls it made, so on and so forth. Okay, so it's a covert mechanism to make sure that it's like, yes, I was never here in the first place. Okay, what this Sleep event and the set event does here, guys, is it will set a timer for once the malware is executed, how long it will take to perform operations before it goes into shutdown. Okay, now if you read this properly, this will actually take a whopping 20 minutes. Some samples I've seen before and I spoke about on Tuesday only take 3 minutes on Hermetic Viper. Okay, this one in particular that I've changed over to is a 20-minute one. Okay, after that it will just completely go to sleep, boot up, and then you'll see this weird ransom note point up that I'll speak about in the other recording. Okay, so that's sort of kind of the overview of Hermetic Viper, okay, from the actual payload stuff. So we've got some covert stuff going on, loads of infection, but as you can see, kind of, yes, it's a bit easier because I've analysed this before and we went over it already a bit earlier on in the week, but you can kind of see the process behind that of using two of them. If you want to use just one of these disassemblers, you can do as well, okay? Now then, I'm actually going to go back out a sec, and I'm actually going to look at the loader, okay? For context, guys, this is what's known as Hermetic Wizard, okay? This is the initial DLL that was launched as with a worm component in order to drop the malware and then export it out of it and then go from there and actually perform the infection part on systems, okay? Now, when you're looking at worms, when you're looking at propagation stuff, the first thing I would say you want to look at, again, is your imports. You want to look at stuff like Net API, you want to look at DNS API, IPHL. This is all got to do with actually grabbing data over the network so it knows how to move and where to go next and who to infect. So for instance, if big one, guys, you want to look at Get IPNet Table. What IPNet Table is, essentially, it will grab from the ARP, that's really important, from ARP specifically, the process between going from IP to MAC and vice versa to understand how many points in your network or understand your network topology and how many people are on the actual network, okay? Also and it is essentially what you'll see is a lot of enumeration happening, scanning over the network to see how many subnets do I have, how many people can I infect and actually jump to, okay? So this is very important for lateral movement. Now then, As you can see here, it doesn't have a direct function like up here, like the DNS stuff, okay? It just has a cross-reference. You can still do that, okay? So if you double-click this, or double-click the cross-reference, it will come up with location, and if you double-click it, and then close this, from here, okay? What you'll see is the IPNet table is decompiled in an undefined function. Now, this is very important to take into consideration, guys. There's a couple reasons why this can happen, okay? One, when it was put through and Ghidra decided to scan it and then do the analysis process, it couldn't pick anything up, so you may need to close your project and redo it. Or, this is the most common way. You'll see this a lot with a lot of propagation stuff like get adapters address, get IPNet table, TCP table. You can infer what they do, but as you can see, there's a lot of if statements and calls to other functions and the stack and movement to the stack, okay? In undefined functions, it means it's going to use this API call, but it doesn't use it from the get-go, meaning it is dynamically imported, okay? So to truly see where this is going to go, Ghidra is essentially not specifically telling us, but showing us, I can't really analyze it further. This is where debugging will really have to come into your own. Now, IDA's not as good as essentially telling you about this. However, it could be very possible that you go back into IDA and you may find out some more, okay? However, when you see a lot of get-based APIs like get IP table, get adapters address, get TCP table, it's essentially collating them, getting them together, ready to be used, but the actual usages of seeing that lateral movement, that movement over if it's going out of a network, this is where the debugging comes into play. Okay? So at that point, I'm going to stop it here, and what we'll do is, next week, as I said, we will actually look at Hermetic Wiper from a debugger's perspective to see can we get what it is trying to do. Okay? So hopefully you guys found this useful, and any questions on this after you've watched it, please let me know.